It's about a young man called Herschell Smalley. Now the Smalley family is a fairly well-known, or at least they were a fairly well-known family here in town, the Smalley Implement Company. And they had came from out east a number of years ago and settled in Manitowoc, and they had a nice family. One of the boys, when the Civil War broke out, one of the boys, Philemon Smalley, joined a Sheboygan group. And there was a younger son that wanted to go to the Civil War battle too. It was exciting for those young men. When they heard about this, they would get a uniform from the government, get a gun, and they would shoot some of those Confederate guerrillas type of thing, and they were going to have lots of excitement because they, just staying here at Manitowoc and working, it wasn't the most exciting idea. So Herschell wanted to go too, but he was less than 16 years old. The older boy, was 8 plus 18, and he was eligible to be a soldier and doing well. And when Herschell wanted to join, Philemon was the older son's name, said to Herschell, "Hey, you're too small to even carry a gun, you're too little, you can't even carry that thing." But Herschell wanted to go, so he decided he'd go. He ran away from home. His dad didn't want him to go either. So he decided that he would go to Sheboygan too, where his brother was. Well, the captain there at Sheboygan took one look at him and said, "Sir, you're not 18 years old. I know you're not, and you're way small." And he was a small 16-year-old, almost 16. He was small to begin with anyhow. And so he just dejectedly went home. Well, there were newspapers that come to Manitowoc from some of the other bigger cities in Wisconsin. And there was a newspaper that his folks got from Milwaukee. And there was a fella in Milwaukee who had drummer boys. And drummer boys could be younger. Oh, he thought, I could probably go and be a drummer boy. And so he asked his dad if he could go. And he said, "Well, you can go. You'll be a drummer boy. At least you won't be carrying a gun or anything. Go, go, go." And so he went down to Milwaukee. And what they did was, for each unit, now he was with the 1st Brigade Band. And each unit has several regiments. And the 1st Wisconsin had 10 regiments, and they each had 2 drummer boys. And so that meant 20 boys were practicing drums. And you know what they did? They didn't have 20 drums right away for these boys. They had a nice long, big trunk of some tree, and had it smoothed off so the boys could sit on it. And they had some little sticks, and they would try to be drummers and move their hands so they could be drummers. And so they practiced and practiced until they finally figured they could probably make some good sounds on a drum, and were given drums. So you can imagine with those 20 boys practicing drums, it was kind of loud and exciting. And they enjoyed it a lot. Well, time finally came for them to go off to war. And this drummer boys didn't carry a gun or anything. What did they do? Of course, they were marching. They helped the cadence with the boys when they were marching. But when it came time for battle, and there were battles, they stayed in the rear, and they took care of the wounded, or they took care of the ill. And so at this particular battle in Chickamauga, it was a terrible battle, and one of the captains was wounded. Well, Herschell Smalley decided it was his job to take care of his captain, so he stayed by his captain, only to be captured. And when the captain went one place, and the little drummer boy went some other place. And what's interesting for Herschell Smalley, he was in a prison for a short amount of time, but he was transferred. Actually, he was transferred 4 times to different prisons, and that life in prison was not very good. They received very little food, very little water, and he described one of the meals he had was a cup of soup with some little beans in it, and as the beans sat in that water, you could see little boll weevils coming out of those beans. So that was the kind of food they had to eat, which was terrible. And over the winter, of course, he was there for 18 months. He was in prisons and transferred from one to another. He was even in Andersonville, if you've heard of Andersonville. My goodness, he was lucky, though, to be transferred out of there. And when finally the war was over, it was a long time that he was having difficulties. And when the war was finally over, he was sent to a different prison, or a different station to be paroled. And he was given a parole. But he was such a young fella, and he was finally went to be free all this time, was given decent food. Actually, they were given a little bit of whiskey, too, to get their spirits up. And of course, he decided he would go around and visit and pretend he was with different units, and he got quite a bit. And by that time, he was feeling kind of good. And next day he wasn't feeling very good, and so he was sick and kind of left behind. Well, his company went off and went home, and here he was left behind, and they thought he was a new recruit. It took him a long time to figure out if he was what he was telling he was. Along the way, he had this beautiful drum. Going back on the stories a little bit, he had this beautiful drum, and when he was captured, when he was staying with his captain, remember when the captain was so ill, his drum was given to the rear, and his drum actually was sent home. And he knew that if anything happened to him, he wanted somebody to have the gun, so have the drum. So on top of the drum, he wrote his will as to what to do with it. And actually, over here is actual copy of the drumhead, and it's written all his writings about what some of the prisons he was in and what he wanted to happen to the drum should anything ever happen to him. And you know, he had a little money too. I'm backing up on myself a little bit here. He had a little money too. Not all boys had money, and when you went to prison, sometimes you could buy a little something. Well, with some of his buddies, 5 buddies from Manitowoc, he divided the money, and so they could buy a few little things too. Well, when the boys were released from prison and went home, they sent the money and the drum to Herschel's dad. So the drum actually arrived home before Herschel did, but eventually Herschel did arrive home. All those experiences from the war, the battles and everything, in his head, and he willingly shared them with his family over the years. And that's the story of Herschel Smalley, the little drummer boy from Manitowoc.